Welcome back to another episode of Wrong Sports, and you know how every week during the college football season we debate who should be the top-ranked team, or who should be in the playoff, or should the playoff be expanded, or why isn't the playoff expanded? Yes, we should continue to have all of those arguments, but there used to be a time in college football where there wasn't a poll, where there were just games played, and then at the end of the season we were like, hey, that team's the best, they should be the national champion. Well, I'm going to go over a season in college football right now where we had the first ever national poll come out to name a national champion. Yes, this is the 1936 season. This is quite the time travel we're going to go on here. We're going to go into a season of college football that named the second Heisman Trophy winner. It also was a season that had 6 bowl games, only 6 of them at the end of the season. But before I get to how the year was won, 1936, make sure you check out my podcast below. I got the link. It's available right now on Google, Spotify, Apple. Plus, make sure you subscribe to the channel below. Ring the bell so you can get updates on when I'm going to be dropping brand new videos. Like and share this video as well with other college football fans, and check me out on Twitter at SportsWronged. But let's turn back the clock to 1936. In the United States, it was a pretty rough time as the country was going through the Great Depression. Meanwhile, though, college football was going through one of its highest points, as there was more than 300 colleges now playing a full-time schedule. Like I said, there were 6 bowl games now that were happening at the end of the year, as there were 2 more added. More big games were happening in big stadiums all around the country, and there would be more polling to find a national champion. That was because coming into the season, writers, fans, and some athletes were looking for a better way to find a college football national champion. Now, obviously, they didn't go with the easiest option, which was to have a playoff system. That would have been very expensive in the 1930s, but anyway, though, there were a few polling systems that were happening throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. The polling systems were quite interesting, as you had the Williamson system, which was calculated by Paul O. Williamson out of New Orleans, the Dickinson system, which was consisting of calculations by University of Illinois professor, yes, you can guess it, Frank Dickinson. Plus, there was a pretty big press poll that was done by the United Press International, which did conduct a season-end poll in 1935, and it had writers from 112 papers in it. The writers gave their top 10, and then the choices were weighted, with 10 points to first, 9 points to second, and etc. The poll resulted in less of a chance of a split national champion, but it was only conducted at the end of the season, with Minnesota winning it at the end of 1935. The thing that all of these polls, though, had in common was that they were done at the end of the season and not done weekly during the season. That would change, though, coming into 1936, as the Associated Press would do something the UP didn't do, which was get a top 10 poll from 35 writers all around the country and do the poll in the middle of the season with weekly polls to follow. The first poll was going to be released October 20th, 1936, with each writer listing his choice for top 10 teams, and points were tallied based on 10 points for first, 9 for second, and etc. Now, they would do this every week for the rest of the regular season. Now, remember that, because it comes in handy for the end of this story. But we're going to start this year with the best team out of the East, at least through the first half of the 1930s. That was the University of Pittsburgh. And Pitt were coached by the legendary Jock Sutherland, who first started his career at Lafayette in eastern Pennsylvania and had a team that was voted as national champion in 1921. Due to his success there, Sutherland would be called quickly to Pitt and went to the western part of the state to coach Pitt starting in 1924. He would find success pretty quickly as he took Pitt to a Rose Bowl trip in 1927, and they were voted as the national champion by some sports writers, and some of those retroactive polls in 1929 and 1931. Sutherland and Pitt continued their dominance with 4 straight 8-1 records from 1931 to 1934, and were 7-1-2 in 1935, only losing to Notre Dame and getting into a scoreless tie with fellow Pittsburgh College Carnegie Tech and their toughest rival the last few years, Fordham. But Pitt would start their season September 24th, and most schools started this late due to wanting to make sure it didn't affect the start of the academic calendar. Pitt was led by a fantastic backfield, but they had an even better line, as they had an All-American on their line. His name was Avril Daniel. And they also had future Nebraska head coach and pro player Bill Glassford on their line. And they would show off their strong line in their first 3 games as they gave up 0 points. And they didn't beat nobodies as they destroyed University of West Virginia 34-0 and then traveled to Ohio Stadium to beat Ohio State, who were coming off of a 5-0 Big Ten record the previous year as they beat them 6-0. Pittsburgh were now 3-0, and they came back to Pittsburgh to play fellow Pittsburgh school Duquesne. Duquesne were also undefeated and unscored on, but they played against much smaller schools, so nobody was giving them really much of a chance to win. Somehow, though, Duquesne stopped Pittsburgh all game from getting into the end zone, and they would score on a long run by a backup running back to win 7-0. The loss would put Pitt at a huge disadvantage to make the Rose Bowl due to the Rose Bowl picking the best team from the East, and many sports writers were writing them off after that early loss. Another important team were coming out of the Midwest. They were the defending national champions, University of Minnesota. They were coached by Bernie Bierman. They went 8-0 the previous last 2 years, and they hadn't suffered a loss in over 3 years. The team would be strong coming back, and they would also have a great core coming back, including their best defenseman, Ed Winseth. Minnesota would start their season with a tough game out west, all the way out west, as they went to Seattle to play University of Washington. The game would be hard fought, with both teams being able to score, but Minnesota was able to get into the end zone one more time to give themselves the 14-7 win. And Washington had been good the previous few years, so this was a really good out-of-conference game and out-of-conference win to start Minnesota's season. After that tough game, Minnesota would have a week off to get back home to play another tough team in the University of Nebraska. Nebraska were coming off of a Big Six championship the previous year, and they were 1-0 already this season after a shutout in Week 1. Minnesota, though, had some knowledge of Nebraska as they played them and beat them the previous year, and they would do that again, shutting out Nebraska by a slim 7-0 margin. Minnesota was now 2-0 with 2 big wins out of conference, and they started their Big Ten games versus Michigan. Michigan was going through some tough times as they won the Big Ten in 1933 and a share of the national title, but in 1934 and 1935, they went 5-11 and only won 2 games in the Big Ten. This game was even easier than the first 2 for Minnesota as they pitched a 26-0 shutout, and Minnesota were now 3-0. And I'll get to more teams in just a second because the first AP poll would come out just after Minnesota's 3rd win, and Minnesota would once again be ranked number 1. And the other 2 teams I mentioned, Pittsburgh and Duquesne, would be ranked number 9 and number 11 respectively. And yes, Duquesne was ranked behind Pitt, even though Duquesne beat them, mostly because of Pitt's strength of schedule and also because Pitt were more well-known nationally, and this poll was made up of sports writers all over the country. Coming in at number 2 in the first poll was a name that you never hear about at the top of polls nowadays in the Duke University football team. Yes, Duke football was very good. It was mostly because they were coached by the legendary Wallace Wade, who left Alabama just after the 1930 season in a shocking move. Duke was immediately better under Wade, as they had a winning record and won the Southern Conference 2 times, including the previous year, 1935. To start 1936, Duke was good again as they were led by a future All-American and halfback Ace Parker. And Wade always coached his defense to be really good, and they would be once again as they were 5-0 with 4 shutouts in those wins. Rounding out the top 5 in that first poll was Army at number 3, and Big Ten teams Northwestern at number 4, and Purdue at number 5. So after that first poll, it gave fans and sports writers even more to talk about during the season because there were lots of top teams in big matchups against each other coming up, and 2 were coming up very soon. The first was a top 5 Big Ten matchup between number 1 Minnesota and Purdue. The game would be played played in Minnesota, and Purdue were coming in with a high-powered offense, as they were 3-0 and 2-0 in the Big Ten, averaging 35 points per game. But when Purdue went up against Minnesota, it wasn't a game, as Minnesota shut them out completely, winning 33-0. And with that, Minnesota would stay number one in the AP poll done on October 26th, and also get all of the first place votes. Since there was no change at the top of the poll, there would be changes right below them, happening at number 2, because there would be a new team in the second poll. And the reason for that was because Duke was upset by Tennessee on the road, and it was a pretty big upset, because Tennessee was only 1-2-1 coming in, and actually hadn't scored in their last 2 games. The loss would send Duke down to number 13, and it would send Pittsburgh, who rose back up the poll after a loss 2 weeks ago. The reason for their rise was because they had a huge win, as they beat number 7 Notre Dame. Notre Dame was coming into the game 3-0, beating Wisconsin and Carnegie Tech in the process. The Notre Dame-Pitt rivalry actually goes all the way back to 1909, but they didn't play every year until the 1930s. But by the time the 1930s came around, it would be an even bigger rivalry, due to both teams being top teams at that point. From 1930 to 1935, these two teams had a pretty strong series against each other. The series was tied 3-3, but all of Notre Dame's wins were very close, while all of Pitt's wins were by shutout. The game in 1936 went like other Pitt wins, as they shut out Notre Dame 26-0 and got back something they lost after that Duquesne loss weeks ago. Right behind Pittsburgh in this new poll was Northwestern at number 3. At number 4 was a team that Minnesota beat already in Washington, and the new top 5 team would be Fordham, and I'll get to them later on because they become pretty important to the story. I know it's pretty crazy to think, but Northwestern in the 1930s were actually a really good team, as they won the Big Ten in the 1930 season, and they were co-champions in 1931. They would hire a good coach, too, right after that, in Pappy Wardolph, who was a winning coach at Oklahoma A&M, and also won a Big Six title in his only year at Kansas State in 1934, which is something that not a lot of people can say they did. Then he went to Northwestern in 1935, and he had a winning record in his first year, but he was building another good team coming into this 1936 season. The team would start the season with a domination win over Iowa, and then just barely got by Ohio State 13-12 at home to get ranked into the top 5. They would defeat in-state rival Illinois right after that to be 4-0 when they would come back home to face number 1 Minnesota. Now again, I have to go back to Minnesota because they were on a 28-game winning streak when they went to Evanston for a Halloween Day game against that Northwestern team. The game was scoreless when Winseth tackled a Northwestern player, and the referee accused Winseth of slugging the Northwestern player. He would get a 15-yard penalty, and the ball was placed at the Minnesota 1-yard line. Northwestern would easily score after that for the only points of the game. Minnesota would suffer their first loss in over 3.5 years. That loss would cause some shakeups, but not as many as you would think, as we would have to go east to the Polo Grounds to see a pretty highly contested game, as we would see the undefeated Fordham team, remember they were ranked number 5, they would take on a team that we have mentioned a lot already in number 2 University of Pittsburgh. But we're going to mention a lot about Fordham right now because they're a really interesting and pretty cool team. Fordham was undefeated right now, and that was mostly because of their amazing line with an even better nickname, as it was called the 7 Blocks of Granite. Now, I've mentioned this team in my best underrated schools of the 1930s. You can see a link above. The team was undefeated at 4-0, and after beating St. Mary's out of California, they would finally get ranked. Fordham and Pitt weren't strangers to each other, as they played the previous few years, and most of them being fairly close. This game was no different, as neither team would be able to score, and it ended in a 0-0 tie. This was coincidentally the same score as their 1935 matchup, and the tie affected the polling by making Minnesota drop from number 1 to number 2 during their loss, and Northwestern being the new number 1 team. Right behind Minnesota, coming in at number 3, would be Fordham after their tie with Pitt, and Pitt would fall all the way to number 5 due to that tie. So again, the teams pretty much stayed the same who were in there in the top 5, they just kind of changed a few spots. The next poll would get us into November 1936, and even though there were a lot of changes in the first few polls, the next few had few changes. For one, the top 3 in the AP poll stayed the same for most of November, with the November 2nd, 9th, and 16th polls all having Northwestern at number 1, Minnesota at number 2, and Fordham at number 3. Behind those 3 were a few teams all jockeying for the last 2 spots in the top 5. 2 of those teams hanging around right now were 2 SEC teams in LSU and Alabama, both of which were unbeaten and wouldn't play each other this year, giving them an easier way to stay unbeaten, especially in the very tough SEC conference. And of course, Pittsburgh were also hanging around and still looking for that outside chance at a Rose Bowl bid as they would continue their tough schedule, beating number 6 Nebraska on the road. This set them up for a Thanksgiving clash with their Pittsburgh rival Carnegie Tech. But before the Thanksgiving rivalry weekend happened, there would be a few games for some top teams. For one of our top teams, Northwestern, which was now the Big Ten champion after beating Michigan on November 14th, they were going to have one more game, but it would be an out-of-conference game as they would play Notre Dame. This game had been played since 1889, and since this rivalry started, it had been all Notre Dame, with Northwestern only winning 2 games up to this point, with last year's game being one of those 2. Notre Dame was struggling though coming in as they were 5-2 after losing to Navy and Pitt like I mentioned. But Notre Dame showed up for this game, and they dominated Northwestern all game, proving they were still the best team in this matchup as they beat Northwestern 26-6, and Northwestern would not end their season undefeated. So now Northwestern's perfect season was ruined, and there would be a new number 1 team, but to the shock of some of the country, Minnesota would be that new number 1 team. Minnesota had a majority of the votes too, as they had 30 first place votes, 20 more than number 2. This would be significant because Minnesota was done for the year, as they were 7-1 and they had no more games left, so unless the pollsters changed their mind over Thanksgiving, Minnesota would be the national champion when the final poll would come out at the end of November. That would be according to AP. Even though they didn't win their conference, they would be the national champion, but we'll get more to that in just a second. Behind Minnesota, and looking somehow to jump them, were 2 teams from the South in Alabama and LSU. Again, both of these teams were out of the SEC, both were unbeaten, but neither LSU or Alabama would play each other this year, so we would never find out who was the better team. But even though they didn't play each other, LSU and Alabama would still play the final weekend of November, and LSU would have the harder game, as they played Tulane. Yes, Tulane was the harder team, and yes, Tulane used to be in the SEC. They were also a big rival of LSU due to them both being in Louisiana. Tulane were 6-2-1 coming in, and already lost to Bama a few weeks before, so this game was for bragging rights and also to ruin the season of LSU. That didn't happen though, as LSU controlled the game and they won 33-0. So now LSU handled their business, so people were looking to see if Bama would do the same. And yes, Bama would do the same, but they would have to have a late rally to do so, as on Thanksgiving they beat Vanderbilt. Neither team had any more games left, but LSU, with their win, would be the sole winner of the SEC. The reason for this was because Bama had tied Tennessee in mid-October, leaving them with a 5-0-1 record, while LSU was 6-0. And due to this, LSU would get the invite to the Sugar Bowl, and Bama would have to sit home. But with there only being 6 bowl games, it was pretty hard to get into a bowl game to begin with. So along with those big rivalry games, there was also a big one happening in New York City, this time between Fordham and NYU. Fordham were still unbeaten, but they had 2 ties after another one against Georgia on November 21st. The second tie sent them out of the top 5, but they still had an outside chance to get an invite to the Rose Bowl. They would play NYU on Thanksgiving in front of 50,000 fans in Yankee Stadium. NYU had an up-and-down season as they were 4-3-1 and hadn't beaten Fordham since 1928 and were actually shut out the previous year. It was looking like Fordham would win by shutout again as they led 6-0, but a late score by NYU and converting the extra point gave them the 7-6 lead, and they would hold on to win. The win would spoil Fordham's unbeaten season, and it was payback for NYU, as NYU lost their unbeaten season the previous year due to Fordham shutting them out. And you can hear more about that in my NYU football discontinued episode, and I'll put the link above to that. But now, with most of the regular season over, there were still a few games left in December, but none that had national title implications. The AP poll would make their final poll coming out on November 30th. I mentioned a little bit ago how Minnesota was number 1 and didn't have another game to possibly lose, so the only way for anyone to jump them would be for the sports writers and voters to change their thinking all season, which had favored Big Ten teams, and change it to an SEC or to someone else. In the final poll, Minnesota wouldn't get jumped, as they would have 25 first-place votes instead of the 30 the previous week, so they lost only 5, but it didn't matter because coming in second was LSU, getting only 9 first-place votes. That meant that Minnesota, for the 3rd straight year, would be named the national champion of college football. Even though Minnesota was the AP poll national champion, there were other selectors, like I mentioned at the beginning, that didn't make their champion until the end of the year. That means after bowl games were played. Plus, there were bowl games happening on New Year's Eve, so that's why they waited. So we know that the Rose Bowl was a big game, and Pittsburgh would get the nod after Fordham lost, and after Pittsburgh ended their season 7-1-1 and being ranked number 3 by pollsters, making them the best team in the East, and were chosen to go to LA on January 1st for the big game. The team they would face would be the best team in the West, and a team that I mentioned because they lost to Minnesota at the beginning of the season. That is Washington. They won the Pacific Coast Conference going 7-0-1, and they were ranked number 5 in that final AP poll. But even though Washington was highly ranked, this wasn't much of a game, as Pittsburgh shut out Washington in the Rose Bowl 21-0, and because of that, many selectors would make Pittsburgh their national champion. So you might see, if you look up 1936 national champion, you will see the AP poll going to Minnesota, but you will see a whole bunch of other selectors picking Pittsburgh for their national champion. There would be one more unbeaten team that would try and make their case for a national title in LSU. They went to the Sugar Bowl to play a rather unknown team from out west in Santa Clara. I went over Santa Clara in my discontinued episode, and you can see the link above to them. But Santa Clara was 7-0 before a December game in Texas to TCU, which they lost. That loss would send Santa Clara out of the top 10, but they would still get the invite to New Orleans against LSU. And in this game, they showed that they were a really good team because Santa Clara came out to a 14-0 start in the first quarter, and they would hold on to win 21-14 and end LSU's unbeaten season, so there would be no argument for a national champion coming out of the South. Minnesota winning the AP title might seem strange now, but they did beat 2 conference winners in their out-of-conference games, as they beat Nebraska, who won the Big Six title again, and Washington, who I mentioned went to the Rose Bowl. But it also helped that Minnesota were riding a 20-plus game winning streak and also a 3-plus year-long winning streak, and they were also in a conference that everyone thought was the best, which was the reason why there was at least 3 Big Ten teams in the top 5 most of the time. Now, I think the biggest difference here would have been if Alabama and LSU would have played each other. This would have given them both a top game for the resume, like I mentioned, and it also would have found a definitive SEC champion instead of LSU winning because of Bama tying a game. the AP poll would get bigger and better as the decades went on, and it would eventually start to name a champion after the bowl games, and that will be another year I will go over coming up next in my How the Year Was Won. But thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like this, please give me a like below. Also, make sure you share this video as well. And of course, make sure you subscribe to the channel, please, below. And also, if you want to help out the channel, please help me out on my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports. And check out the podcast. It's available on all podcast streams. You can get the link below. Thanks, guys.